To find the giants of the Middle Ages, you must first ignore the fairy tales and look at the metallurgy. If you walk through the royal armories in Leeds or the Fries Museum in the Netherlands, you will find artifacts that simply do not fit the standard human frame of the 15th century. The average height of a medieval male, stunted by malnutrition and disease, was roughly 5 feet 6 inches. Yet, we have physical proof of men who towered nearly 2 feet above their peers. The most terrifying, historically verified example is Pierre Gerloff's Donia, known as Gruta Pier, Big Pier. He was a Frisian pirate and freedom fighter who lived in the early 1500s. While legends claim he was a monster, the physical evidence, his helmet and his sword, suggests a man standing roughly 7 feet tall. In an era of short men, he was a biological titan. But science tells us that his size was likely not just genetics, it was pathology. The primary evidence of his existence is his sword, preserved to this day. It is a Zweihander, two-handed sword, that measures 2.13 meters, 7 feet, in length, and weighs 6.6 kilograms, 14.6 pounds. For decades, historians dismissed such weapons as bearing swords, heavy, blunt, ceremonial objects carried in parades, never intended for war. A 14-pound sword is physically impossible for a normal human to swing effectively in combat due to the rotational inertia. You would be too slow to block or parry. However, metallurgical analysis of Groot Pier's blade tells a different story. It shows signs of tempering and edge sharpening that bearing swords do not have. Furthermore, microscopic analysis of the blade's edge reveals impact trauma consistent with high-velocity collisions with other steel. This was not a parade prop. It was a kill tool. The biomechanics of a 7-foot man wielding a 7-foot sword creates a combat anomaly known as the radius of unreachable death. In medieval combat, reach is king. A standard knight with a long sword has a striking range of about 4 feet. Groot Pier had a striking range of nearly 10 feet. He could decapitate a standard pikeman before the enemy could even enter his own engagement zone. But the giant knight phenomenon comes with a dark medical reality. Paleopathologists who examine the skeletons of exceptionally tall individuals from this era often find the telltale signs of acromegaly. This is a disorder caused by a benign tumor on the pituitary gland that pumps excess growth hormone into the body. While this hormone made them huge, it also deformed them. The bones of the brow ridge thicken, the jaw protrudes, prognathism, and the joints undergo massive calcification. These giants were formidable warriors, but they were likely fighting in constant, agonizing pain. The Giant of Castelnau, a series of bone fragments discovered in France dating to the Bronze/Iron Age transition, suggests a human standing over 11 feet tall, though modern estimates are more conservative. However, medieval skeletons often show severe arthritis in the knees and spine before the age of 30. The invincible knight was actually a dying man, his body slowly destroying itself under its own hormonal overdrive. Lords and kings didn't treat these men as heroes. They treated them as biological siege engines, weaponizing their disease until their hearts, enlarged and overworked, finally gave out. If the swords prove the existence of the giants, the armor proves their suffering. In the collections of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, there stands a suit of armor belonging to a mercenary named Barthelme Bonn. He lived in the 16th century and stood over 2.60 meters, 8 feet 6 inches, tall. For a long time, historians believed this armor was a fake, a grotesque, made for a carnival. But modern forensic anthropometry has analyzed the articulation points of the steel. Armor is not just clothing, it is a second skeleton. For a suit to function, the rivets and joints must align perfectly with the wearer's biological pivot points: elbows, knees, hips. If you put a normal man in a giant suit, he cannot move because his knees won't align with the steel knees. The analysis of Bond's armor shows that it was functional. It was worn. But it also reveals the medical horror of his life. The breastplate is elongated and narrow, and the spine curvature suggests severe kyphosis, hunchback. The sabatons, foot armor, are disproportionately wide, accommodating the massive, swollen feet typical of advanced acromegaly. This was not a superhero suit. It was a steel brace holding a crumbling body together. This brings us to the Doppelsöldner phenomenon, the double pay men. In the 16th century, German Landsknecht mercenary companies had a specific pay grade for great men. These were soldiers strong enough to wield the true Zweihänder, or the heavy arquebus. The physics of medieval warfare dictated that a larger combatant had a lethal leverage advantage. In a bind, when two swords cross, the fighter with the higher center of gravity and longer lever arm can dominate the center line, forcing the opponent's blade aside with simple torque. However, the economic records of these mercenary bands tell a grim actuarial tale. The survival rate of these giant soldiers was statistically lower than that of the average pikeman. Why? Because they were high-value targets. On the battlefield, a 7-foot man is a magnet for arrows and early firearms, but biologically they were also glass cannons. The heart of a giant is their weak point. In a normal human, the heart pumps blood against gravity to the brain. In a 7-foot giant, the hydrostatic pressure required to pump blood vertically is significantly higher. When you add the weight of a 40-kilogram suit of plate armor and the extreme cardiovascular stress of hand-to-hand combat, the heart is pushed to its breaking point. Historical accounts often describe giant warriors collapsing suddenly, not from a wound, but from apoplexy, heart failure or stroke, in the middle of a melee. The armor found in museums often shows a lack of breaths, ventilation holes, suggesting that these men likely suffered from overheating, hyperthermia, much faster than their smaller counterparts. The square-cube law applies to heat dissipation too. A giant body generates massive internal heat, but has less relative surface area to sweat it out. Inside that steel shell, they were literally cooking alive during battle. Finally, we must look at the dark history of the Potsdam Giants, the Lange Curls, which, while slightly later, 18th century, reveals the scientific obsession with weaponizing height. King Frederick William I of Prussia tried to create a regiment of super soldiers by strictly recruiting men over 6 feet 2 inches. He even attempted early eugenics, forcing tall soldiers to marry tall women to breed a race of giants. The result was a biological disaster. The regiment was plagued by health issues. The soldiers suffered from gigantism-related joint pain and could hardly march long distances. The king eventually realized that while a wall of giants looks terrifying psychologically, biologically they are inefficient. They require more food. They require custom-made uniforms, a logistical nightmare, and they die younger. The experiment proved that in the evolution of warfare, endurance and logistics always beat raw size. The giants of the Middle Ages were not a superior race. They were a medical curiosity exploited by kings until their bodies broke down. To fully understand why giants disappeared from history, we must look at the buildings they left behind. Castles were not built for giants, they were built to defeat them. If you analyze the architecture of a standard 12th century keep, you are looking at a weaponized environment designed for a man standing 5 feet 6 inches. The doorways are low, the corridors are narrow, but the ultimate anti-giant device was the spiral staircase. Almost all medieval spiral staircases wind clockwise going up. This was a calculated ergonomic defense. It allowed the defender, standing higher, to swing his sword with his right arm freely, while the attacker, coming up, had his right arm blocked by the central stone pillar. For a 7-foot giant, a spiral staircase was a death trap. His shoulders would jam against the walls. He would have to hunch over to avoid concussing himself on the low ceiling. In a siege, the giant knight was tactically useless inside the very structures he was supposed to defend. He was a field weapon that malfunctioned indoors. But the final nail in the coffin of the medieval giant was not architectural. It was forensic pathology. Excavations of mass graves from the Battle of Towton, 1461, the bloodiest battle in English history, have revealed the brutal reality of being the big guy in a melee. Archaeologists found skeletons of men who were significantly taller than the average, some approaching 6.5 feet, but their bones tell a horrific story of target fixation. The tallest skeletons had the highest number of post-mortem mutilations. In a shield wall, the tallest man is the most visible threat. He attracts the most arrows. He attracts the most aggression. The forensic evidence shows that enemy soldiers would swarm the giant, aiming for the legs to bring him down. Once down, the armor was pried open. Being a giant didn't make you a hero, it made you a trophy. The survival rate for the tallest men in these mass graves was statistically 0. Furthermore, the giants were victims of their own fuel source. To grow that big in the Middle Ages required immense caloric intake, which usually meant a diet of the super-rich: meat, wine, and organ tissue. This led to gout, the disease of kings. Gout creates uric acid crystals in the joints, particularly the feet. Combining the joint pain of acromegaly with the crippling agony of gout meant that many of these giants were invalids by the age of 40. The legendary Green Knight, or the Black Knight of folklore, was likely a man in constant, excruciating pain, fueled by alcohol to numb the nerves, encased in steel to hold his crumbling joints together. Ultimately, the age of giants was ended by chemistry. The invention of the firearm democratized death. An arquebus ball fired by a starving 5-foot-tall peasant hits just as hard as a sword swung by a 7-foot giant. In fact, a giant is a bigger target. The physics of gunpowder rendered physical strength irrelevant. The square-cube law that made giants slow and heavy made them easy pickings for musketeers. Evolution and technology conspired together. The future of war belonged to the small, the fast, and the organized. The giants were left behind, buried in oversized coffins, leaving only their rusted swords as proof that they once tried to fight against the laws of physics. To fully grasp the nightmare of being a giant in the Middle Ages, we must look away from the battlefield and look at the dinner table. The primary enemy of the medieval giant was not a sword, it was thermodynamics. The average medieval peasant survived on a caloric intake of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories a day, mostly from grain and weak ale. This is barely enough to sustain a 5-foot-6-inch frame engaged in farm labor. But a man standing 7 feet tall, approximately 2.13 meters, with the muscle mass required to move that frame, has a basal metabolic rate, BMR, that is exponentially higher. According to the Kleiber's law of metabolic scaling, a human of that size engaged in the high-intensity interval trauma of combat training would require upwards of 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day just to maintain homeostasis. In a world plagued by the Little Ice Age, where crop failures were annual events and famine was a season, a giant was a biological impossibility. He was a walking famine. This created a brutal economic reality. The mercenary trap. A giant simply could not be a peasant. He would starve to death on a farm ration. His body would cannibalize its own muscle tissue within weeks. Catabolism. Therefore, the only way for a giant to survive was to sell his violence to a lord or a king who could afford the massive, meat-rich diet required to fuel him. This is why giants in history are almost exclusively found in the retinues of the elite, or as highly paid doppelsoldners. They weren't fighting for glory, they were fighting for calories. They were biological engines that required expensive fuel. And if they stopped killing, they stopped eating. This dependency created a psychological toll. Historical records often describe these men as prone to melancholy and rage. Modern psychiatry might diagnose this as the result of chronic pain and isolation, but biologically, it is also a symptom of hangry on a lethal scale. Chronic hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, driving aggression. Furthermore, we must analyze the endocrine collapse. Most medieval giants suffered from pituitary gigantism, where the tumor usually crushes the pituitary cells responsible for other hormones, specifically testosterone. This leads to a condition called hypogonadism. While they were tall and strong, many were sexually underdeveloped and sterile. This is the tragic irony of the warrior giant. They were seen as the ultimate alpha males, the pinnacle of virility. But biologically, many were castrated by their own brain tumors. They were the last of their line. They had no children to carry on their genes. This explains why we don't see clans of giants in history. It was always a lone anomaly, a genetic lightning strike that burned bright and died out in a single generation. The giant knight was a lonely, sterile, starving creature, weaponized by a feudal system that saw him as livestock rather than a human being. The armor that protected him was also his cage, and the sword he swung was the only thing earning him the massive pile of meat he needed to keep his heart beating for one more day. To understand the terrifying lethality of a medieval giant, we must apply rotational mechanics to the battlefield. There is a persistent myth in video games and movies that large characters are slow. This violates the physics of the lever. Consider a standard knight swinging a 3-foot arm holding a 3-foot sword. The radius of his swing is 6 feet. Now consider a giant like Pierre Gerloff's Donia, a 4-foot arm holding a 7-foot Zweihander. The radius is 11 feet. Even if the giant rotates his torso at the same angular velocity, RPM, as the small man, the tip speed of his sword is nearly double. V equals R times omega, velocity equals radius times angular velocity. This means the giant didn't need to be fast. The physics of his reach meant that the tip of his blade was moving at speeds that the human eye of a standard opponent literally could not track in close quarters. Furthermore, we must look at momentum transfer, P equals mv. When a 6-kilogram sword, moving at high velocity, hits a standard 1-kilogram arming sword raised in a parry, the physics of the collision are catastrophic for the defender. The kinetic energy cannot be absorbed by the wrist of a normal man. The parry would simply collapse, driving the defender's own blade into his skull. You could not block a giant. You had to dodge him, and dodging an 11-foot zone of death is statistically impossible in the mud and crush of a medieval formation. However, while physics made them gods of offense, neurology made them incredibly vulnerable. The specific pathology of pituitary gigantism involves a tumor, adenoma, growing on the pituitary gland. This gland sits in a bony pocket at the base of the skull called the sella turcica, directly underneath the optic chiasm, the point where the optic nerves from your eyes cross over to the brain. As the tumor grows, it presses upward, crushing these nerves. The specific medical result is bitemporal hemianopsia, the loss of peripheral vision. This is the Achilles heel of the giant. Most of these historical titans were likely suffering from severe tunnel vision. They could see what was directly in front of them with terrifying clarity, but they were legally blind to their sides. This explains the tactical doctrine used to kill them. Flanking. A giant was a tank with no side windows. In a duel, he was invincible. But in a chaotic melee, a nimble soldier could simply step 45 degrees to the left or right, enter the giant's blind spot, and sever the femoral artery or hamstring the knee. The giant wouldn't even see the blow coming. The historical accounts of giants raging and swinging wildly are not descriptions of berserker fury. They are descriptions of a blind man trying to hit enemies he can hear but cannot see. Finally, we must address the logistics of the mount. A medieval knight is only as effective as his horse. The average medieval war horse, destrier, was not the massive Clydesdale we imagine. They were compact, muscular animals roughly 15 hands high. A standard knight in full armor weighed maybe 250 pounds, 113 kilograms. A giant like Barthelmebon in his custom armor would weigh upwards of 450 pounds, 205 kilograms. The square cube law applies to the horse's spine too. Putting a giant on a standard warhorse would break the animal's back or exhaust it within minutes of a charge. To ride, a giant needed a genetic freak of a horse, a massive draft animal that was likely slow, lumbering, and incredibly expensive to feed. This relegated the giant to fighting on foot, infantry. And on foot, in the mud of Agincourt or Towton, the sheer weight of their own body became a death sentence. Once a 400-pound armored giant slipped in the mud and fell, he could not get up. The energy required to do a burpee in 80 pounds of steel with a body that is already straining its heart is unavailable. They didn't die in glorious duels. They slipped, fell, and were suffocated by the mud, or stabbed on the ground like overturned turtles. The extinction of the giant was not an accident. It was an inevitability driven by the mathematics of ballistics. In 1400, being big was an advantage. In 1600, it was a suicide note. The introduction of black powder weaponry changed the variables of war from force to probability. A standard musket, like the Brown Bess used later, had an effective accuracy range of perhaps 50 to 75 yards. It was a weapon of volume, not precision. Soldiers fired in volleys, creating a wall of lead. In this new geometric reality, a giant soldier was a statistical liability. A man who is 7 feet tall and broad-shouldered presents a surface area that is approximately 30% to 40% larger than a standard conscript. In a volley fire situation, the giant catches bullets that would have flown harmlessly over the head of a shorter man. He is a bullet sponge. Furthermore, the physics of armor penetration rendered their strength useless. A Zweihänder requires muscle to penetrate plate. A musket ball, traveling at 400 meters per second, carries enough kinetic energy to punch through the thickest breastplate a giant could wear. To make armor bulletproof for a giant, you would have to increase the thickness of the steel to the point where the suit would weigh 150 kilograms. This crosses the biomechanical threshold. Even a giant cannot walk in that. So, as armies modernized, the great men were fired. They were stripped of their armor and sent home, or worse, put in the circus. This marks the transition from the giant as warrior to the giant as freak. This leads us to the most heartbreaking scientific chapter, the theft of Charles Byrne. Byrne was the Irish giant of the 18th century, standing 7 feet 7 inches. He was a celebrity, but he was terrified of doctors. He knew that when he died, the surgeons wanted to dissect him. He explicitly requested to be buried at sea in a lead coffin to prevent this. But he was betrayed by biology. He died at age 22, likely from the complications of his tumor and alcoholism. His body was stolen by the famous surgeon John Hunter, who bribed the undertaker. Hunter didn't treat Byrne as a human. He treated him as a specimen. He boiled Byrne's body in a giant cauldron to strip the flesh and obtain the skeleton. Today, Byrne's skeleton hangs in the Hunterian Museum in London. It is the ultimate scientific evidence of the giant's curse. Forensic analysis of his bones reveals the texture of the bone is porous and rough, a sign of rapid, uncontrolled growth that outpaced the body's ability to mineralize calcium. His vertebrae show microfractures from carrying his own weight. Science learned a lot from him, but it proved that the human body plan has a hard cap. We are not designed to be 8 feet tall. The cube-square law eventually crushes the biological machinery. The heart enlarges, cardiomegaly, until the valves fail. The nerves stretch until they misfire. The bones weaken until they snap. Evolution made a choice. It selected for efficiency, not size. We are the descendants of the 5-foot 6-inch peasant who needed less food, fit in a foxhole, and didn't have a tumor pressing on his brain. We outsourced gigantism to our machines. We built tanks to be our armor and cranes to be our strength. The biological giants were a failed experiment of nature, a glimpse of what humans could be, but a brutal lesson in why we shouldn't be. The silence of the medieval battlefields today is not just the absence of war. It is the absence of the titans who walked there, proving that in the end, physics is the only undefeated champion in history.